What is one of the first things you can hear in a conversation regarding Final Fantasy V? I would say there's an 80% chance that conversation will involve the game being underrated. It's reached the point that it is so often called underrated that some may argue it's now overrated, just because it's being called underrated all the time. Now, I do understand where this comes from. FF5 has historically battled with 3 for the title of least accessible game in the mainline franchise. We all know by now that its SNES version never came to the West due to the inability to find a proper translation. It then did come on the PlayStation 1 through the Final Fantasy Anthology, which is a terrible version, blatant loading times on a system with a CPU 11 times faster than the original console it came from. And then, in 2006, there was a port to the Game Boy Advance, which at the time was the best official version of the game. Some would say it still is. So, it is understandable that there's this view of it being underappreciated, purely because a lot of people would just not have played it based on the simplicity of accessibility. I'm not even going to dignify the mobile ports. But now, as of 2022/23, depending on your platform, Final Fantasy V is widely available. So anyone who's interested can relatively easily play it, and therefore can have their opinion of it. So surely we can now get rid of that underrated tag. I disagree. Firstly, that's just not how it works. Just because it's more accessible doesn't instantly mean everyone's now played it. But more importantly, while I haven't heard a negative opinion about the game, I'm sure there are people who have that, but we shouldn't listen to such dirty people. While I haven't heard a negative opinion, I still believe it's underrated just because I've not heard many people say that it's one of the best games in the franchise. And what's so masterful about it, it achieves that status while actually being quite generic. Let's talk about how. So let me just start with some very quick defining of terms, because I know the word generic has got some pretty negative connotations. So when I'm using the word generic, I mean that it predominantly makes use of established tropes and mechanics, not doing too much new to what has been done before. Note that I said too much because I know that 5 does have some innovations that we will get into. So I'm not using generic in a pejorative way here. In fact, my goal is to show how it can be used positively. And with that definition given, let me now justify why I'm making the claim, starting with the story. So a quick plot summary. We begin our journey with Bartz, or Butts, if you don't want to deny him his true self, who is wandering with Boko, his chocobo, when their journey is interrupted by a meteor suddenly hitting the planet. Upon investigation, they meet Lena, the Princess of Tycoon, and Galuf, an old man, with amnesia. After Lena reveals that she's going to the Wind Shrine following the disappearance of her father, they head in that direction, attempting to steal a pirate ship along the way and so meeting Faris. At the shrine, they witness the crystal shatter, at which point they are appointed as the Warriors of Light, tasked with preventing the others from doing the same, given that they are kind of vital to the functioning of the world. However, throughout their journey to do so, which honestly they don't actually do very well, they discover that the crystals actually had an additional role from this effect they have on the environment. They were used by a group called the Dawn Warriors, a group of rulers from the world but in another dimension. they use the crystals to seal away the evil warlock X-Death, who has now been freed by them shattering. As a result, it is now up to the Warriors of Light to give him a right good bashing, which of course they do end up doing. So I think we can agree this is a pretty standard plot for a fantasy story, especially if you compare it to the previous game that sent you off to the moon. But it's not just in terms of the general plot. There are a lot of tropes throughout the plot which we have become quite accustomed to over the years. Okay, we're going to get into like massive spoiler territory now. We have the character Galuf, who has amnesia, but then remembers he is one of the Dawn Warriors who's healed X-Death away. I.e., the character with amnesia discovering they are vital to the plot. You have the reveal of Faris actually being Lena's sister, which ticks off two boxes, the estranged siblings, and the gruff outcast who actually belongs to nobility. Fun fact during the scene where they reunite, by the way, while the characters are falling at the start of the scene, I noticed while editing that there's a few frames where Bart's doesn't have the falling animation like the other characters. Instead, he just kind of hovers down in his normal pose. And then we also have Bart's father being one of the Dawn Warriors, which ticks off the trope of a character needing to continue on with a legacy. And also, just the Warriors of Light was established in the Final Fantasy franchise from the first game. So, these are all well-established motifs which have been present in many narratives over the years. But rather than being a collection of tired tropes, Final Fantasy V absolutely nails them to create one of the franchise's most enjoyable and honestly compelling plots. And it does it in a few ways. The first one is probably the most easy to list as a requirement for good narrative, but not nearly as easy to actually implement it, and that is pacing. Most often, when a narrative is criticized for pacing, it's usually because it's too long and it drags on, which then can easily prompt the response of, shorter is best. But it's not as simple as that. Not just because another foible is rushing through a story, but because you can have both at the same time. Particularly with generally longer narratives that are going to have more arcs and plot points, you can have occasions where one segment is dragged out for too long, but then another might be too rushed. And on that mention of longer narratives, the pace with which we move is dependent on the genre of media we are engaging with. For example, a first-person shooter generally works best with a fast-moving narrative that expeditiously moves you from plot point to plot point, punctuating it with regular events that facilitate more gameplay opportunities. While in contrast, an RPG works well having peaks and troughs of escalation and downtime that allow for reflection and more engagement with characters. And even that formula isn't set in stone. If it's done well, a moment of quiet reflection in an FPS can have a great impact in the middle of the chaotic action. And then it also depends on the medium. Those reading a book are more prepared for a longer build-up to events, as opposed to a movie which needs to accelerate a bit more. And in a similar vein, games need to balance their cutscenes with gameplay. Anyway, the point is, my view on the matter is that it must be as long as it needs to be. And Final Fantasy V is as long as it needs to be. Events proceed naturally and happen within appropriate distances from each other, alternating well between moments to progress the plot and those that delve further into characterization. But it's not just done with the cutscenes, for lack of a better word. The pacing is also assisted by the gameplay. Firstly, is with one of the most common means done in gaming, difficulty. If you are designing a game and are concerned about a player moving through it too quickly, the simplest solution is just to put a difficult dungeon or boss which grinds them to a halt. But of course, you don't want to make it too difficult and then just create a wall to progression. And we see a pretty good threading of the line here. With a slight caveat, the battles aren't overtly difficult, but at the same time aren't a walkthrough. Well, apparently apart from one, where I guess I just managed to use the right attack. But apart from that one, they are fairly lengthy and involved, usually having moments where you need to alternate between being on the offensive and on the defensive, as well as bosses having alternate phases where you need to change up your means of attack. So it makes the battles a pretty good stopgap to moderate the speed with which you move through the plot. But I did mention that is with a caveat. And that caveat is, provided you remain appropriately leveled. If you are underleveled, these fights will be a massive slog, and will likely end in defeat. Obviously, by contrast, if you are overleveled, they will be a doddle, but to be overleveled would require you to stop the grind, which would slow down your progression anyway, so you could say it kind of fixes the issue. So being underleveled is the main concern. And that's pretty well combated by the world design. Until you reach the traditional JRPG late game opening up of the world, your movement between the pretty segmented map is very limited, with you often having to walk between locations for pretty big stretches, only getting other means of travel for short periods. And this means of traveling will generally mean you will get involved in enough battles so that you aren't underleveled when the boss fight comes, and so it's not just a brick wall, and serves the job of pacing your progress from location to location. And then, even after these restricted segments, there's still some pretty good moderation of your pace. Once you're given the airship, or the ship, and therefore have more leeway in where to go, you aren't told exactly where to go. You are left to do some actual exploration and find the place that continues the plot, which will lead you to do more leveling up and also possibly discover new locations, including the ones with these fuckers. There is another thing which adds to the pacing, but it falls under a segment we're going to speak about in more detail later. For now, I will say it's very well done, but not the only thing which makes for an enjoyable narrative. This here is another one that doesn't have a set way of how it needs to be done. Depending on your genre, the story you want to tell, and the themes you are trying to examine, your tone will be dictated by that. And in a similar manner, you don't always have to maintain one type of atmosphere throughout your narrative, nor do you even necessarily have to change it at all. I do think that this is one predominantly affected by length. I've spoken before, I think I've spoken before, I don't remember if it was actually in a video or just a script I did. To the best of my knowledge, I have spoken before about my bugbear that can sometimes happen with more overly serious plots. In that, if a plot continues to be dreary and miserable for far too long, I will start to be less engaged with it. I just start to think that when you've been in a narrative for like 20 hours and every character is just being miserable the entire time, you kind of get this idea of, what are we doing here? Like, what are you even fighting for if everything is so shit? This, of course, can be combated with moments of levity, characterization, or general wholesomeness. But of course, you can go too far the other way of being too overly mirthful and then just not seem to be taking the subject matter very seriously. And Final Fantasy V is more on that side, going with a deliberate intent of being lighthearted. So, of course now, we have that risk of undermining your inevitable serious moments with jarring tonal shifts. But that is avoided here. Earnest moments in Final Fantasy V really do hit home and leave their impression. And I would say this is managed by three things. Firstly, the humour is grounded and earnest. Well, as grounded as you can be in a world with magical crystals. But what I mean is that the humour is mostly derived from slapstick and farcical situations, rather than any kind of sarcastic or irreverent humour, which we've become so accustomed to these days. Thanks, dickhead. And this earnestness allows a transition into more serious moments without that jarring tonal shift. Because the light-hearted vibe hasn't been a flippant one that treats events as if they are inconsequential. I'll give an example which I think illustrates the point pretty well. In the second proper dungeon of the game, the party has been shipwrecked, and after making their way to shore, they become transfixed by a siren who uses their memories to keep them entranced. But this is countered by the fact that Galuf has lost his memory, so he doesn't actually remember what she's attempting to control him with. And I mean, that is silly. But it doesn't remove from the gravity of the situation, because firstly, it actually is a bit of foreshadowing to future character revelations, but also, once he breaks everyone from their trance, the siren attacks and triggers a boss fight, with the obvious implication that she's going to kill you if you lose the fight. So, a silly joke doesn't completely bring down the seriousness of the matter. And this is also the only boss appearance with this kind of comedy element. Well, apart from a specific one that we're going to get onto later. Otherwise, plot crucial bosses are stern and serious, which leads to the other factor for the tone moderation. There is usually a good deal of build-up to transition between moments that are comedic and those that are particularly emotional. Generally, it comes at the end of a dungeon or after traveling between two locations, which means a good deal of combat and exploration provide time for that tonal transition. And the third is something that AAA companies can't really do anymore. A benefit that comes inherent with the pixel art style of the earlier Final Fantasy games. Pixel sprites are very expressive. The animations you can do with them and the expressions you can draw on them give an innate humorous quality that allows you to thread this fine line where you can have serious moments but still have a little bit of silliness happening in them. For example, we have the moment where Lena and Faris discover that they are long-lost sisters. And while they're having their very touching reunion, you've got Galuf in the bottom corner of the room trying to figure out how to escape. So these are all things that make the plot more engaging. But let's get on to what's probably the most important contributor. Okay, I can remember that I have spoken about this before. That if you're going to have a story based around a very small locus of characters, you really need to make sure you've nailed those characters. And FF5 definitely has. Be it our main cast or support characters. The people we meet along the way in our journey start off with a more standard one-note personality, but go on to reveal more depth, or at least provide a jumping off point for our main characters to reveal more depth. Starting off with Bartz, our wandering adventurer. He begins being considerate but aloof, not really that interested in involving himself into anything which would require a great deal of commitment. He finds Lena in distress and so naturally helps her, but when she reveals that she has a further quest to continue on with, he's happy to part ways. Only ending up going with her and Galuf because of an earthquake and needing to rescue them again. But as we continue, we discover someone suffering with struggles of identity and meaning, as he lost his mother due to illness at a young age, as well as the fact that his father disappeared for reasons unknown to him. This then gets amplified later as we discover that his father was one of the Dawn Warriors, and so he becomes instilled with a sense of heroism and needing to continue a legacy, which makes a pretty humorous contrast with the fact that he's afraid of heights. Keeping with some of those themes, we move on to Lena, one of my favourite characters in the franchise. The Princess Tycoon, heir to the throne. Naturally, with this position, she carries an air of that royalty, but predominantly she's a very compassionate person with a very steely willingness to help others. This combines with her noble inclination to generate two additional traits: a bravery to put herself into peril to achieve her goals, but also an innocence and naivety to the outer world. Both are very well put on display early into the game when they need to get to the Wind Shrine, and so need to cross the sea. Having snuck into a pirate den, she believes she can appeal to their kindness and borrow their ship, and then goes even further, thinking that if she reveals her fact that she's a princess to them, it'll convince them to help her. So I loved her from that moment 30 minutes in already. Then we can add on to that one of the struggles she shares with Bartz. I mentioned Bartz having been abandoned. With Lena, we get a lot of moments of her fighting to stop being abandoned. And with that, we get the most emotional scenes in the game, with her, not to get too spoilery, attempt to save her Windrake, as well as what she's also almost willing to do, to save her sick mother. Which brings us to Faris. She starts off doing that 12th night thing, where she's pretending to be a man in order to reign over her pirate crew. As a result, she is gruff and threatening, leaving the men in the party in fear of her, before she goes on to give them complicated feelings. This is actually considered to be woke on that stupid fucking woke detector list, by the way. I love the way that leftists hate classics like Shakespeare, but at the same time, the tropes he used were woke and gay. Anyway, her opening up about actually being a woman is followed up by some more vulnerabilities and comradeship with others, leading up to her reuniting with Lena as her long-lost sister, which then allows for more development as she now has to reconciliate her affiliation with the rough and tumble pirate life and her return to royalty. In contrast, we have Galuf. Refreshingly for a character with amnesia, he doesn't just have a personality of, I don't remember anything. He actually starts out as one of the funnier characters, with his crazy old man bravado coupled with his using being an old man to be lazy and avoid criticism. So this just adds a bit of flavouring throughout. added with those aforementioned moments of his amnesia leading to silly things. However, he's not amnesiated the whole time. And we have an interesting change-up after he remembers that he's one of the Dawn Warriors. Suddenly, he becomes one of the most badass characters ever, taking charge and getting shit done. But still having a softer side through his relationship with his granddaughter Krill. So, a very well done main cast which imprints itself on you early on and then endear themselves even more the further you go. But it's not just restricted to them. While the majority of the NPCs do just exist for plot continuation or assisting with development of the main cast, there is one all on his own. The first, and still the best, appearance of Gilgamesh. I did enjoy him in Rebirth, but 5 just gives the perfect amount of his stupidity as well as gauging the length and frequency of his appearances, and also gives him a fun twist to end his arc. Say the line, Gilgamesh. He also helps with the tone moderation I was talking about earlier. He is a source of a lot of the dedicated moments of humor. While gags and short comedic segments can be provided by anyone, the appearance of Gilgamesh signals that you are entering into a dedicated extended period of it. And having this character clearly marked as your dedicated source of comedy helps with delineation. After 1 or 2 encounters, likely 1, you will know that the appearance of Gilgamesh signals we are entering into a light-hearted segment. And then when we are done with it, we are given a clear sign we are ending it, and so some time to acclimatize to a changeover in tone. For example, when X-Death banishes him, but then you're needed to enter the next room to actually fight him. The older Final Fantasies tended to be pretty good at shifting to major plot points like this, generally by having a boss fight acting as a barrier to it, and that fight being foreshadowed to be coming soon by the appearance of a save point in the dungeon. But we don't just have Gilgamesh. It would be extremely wrong not to mention Sid and Mid, our granddad and grandson nerd duo. They're just endearingly positive. They carry this infectious energy whenever on screen, as well as being another reliable source of humor, while also being plot vital characters that are responsible for some of the most important moments of progression, proving that story development characters can be fun. But they don't just give wacky asides or continue the plot, they also assist with highlighting character dynamics, as their relationship mirrors Galuf and Krill's, Galuf's granddaughter. Honestly though, there isn't too much to say about her. She is one of the characters who doesn't have too much depth to her. That doesn't make her a bad character though. She's still very likable and her motivation is completely understandable. And she provides us with some assistance in enjoying another character, in Boko, Bart's Chocobo companion, who starts out just being a cute chocobo that also characterizes Bart as that lone wanderer who doesn't have too many connections, but later he develops into having a wife and family, who he probably supports through his position as the professor who carries out the job tutorial, before returning to assist Bart and we get the continuation of that dynamic, where he mostly just gets blamed for Bart's incompetence. So, a pretty standard fare plot that makes use of pretty common story tropes creates an engaging and enjoyable narrative through good pacing, tone moderation, and brilliant characters. I gave a spoiler warning and didn't divulge too intensely into key character moments, but honestly, it's done so well that even if you do know the plot beats, it's still a great experience. But it's not just done through narrative means, it's also assisted through something unique to the medium. Yes, crazy. A game is helped by having good gameplay. Final Fantasy V is the second game in the franchise to feature the ATB battle system introduced in 4. And it really is a case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's no real changes to this aspect. The unique feature is bringing back one introduced in Final Fantasy III. The job system has returned, but with improvement. As before, there are a selection of jobs which will determine the character's abilities, the weapons they can use, and will adjust their base attributes. But now, in addition, you will earn AP, which levels the jobs up and allows abilities to be permanently learned. Meaning that even if you change jobs, you can still use those learned abilities. And this allows for some really fun customization. You have 4 characters who can each be assigned a primary job and then given a second job's main ability. Basically, allowing 8 jobs to be in a battle at once. And with a few certain items, you could kind of even make that 3 or 4. For example, the dancer is based off of the character learning different dances which have various effects. But there's also a knife called the Dancing Dirk, which will mean that when you attack, the character will randomly use one of those dances. And this led me to having a fun arrangement. I made Lena a ninja, which gave her the ability to dual wield. I then gave her the Dancing Dirk and the main gouge, which gives the chance of parrying and so completely negating physical damage. And then I assigned her the summoning ability she had learned. So she had the abilities of a ninja, a summoner, a dancer, and a knight. Wait, what's his name? That just looks like they're calling him a slur. I think we can agree that's a lot of customization with how you want to make your party, and so multiple ways to tackle enemies. I mean, of course there are still jobs that are overpowered. The Dragoon is disgusting. I got drawn into a mini-boss on very low health, but was able to survive simply by just Dragoon jumping throughout the entire fight. But this isn't the only way to success. You are free to find your own way and your own combinations that you want to use. I also really like that each character gets a unique sprite for each of their jobs. So, there's customization to keep combat feeling unique and creating a continued sense of progression. But it also contributes to the pacing I was talking about before. With each job level, you learn a new ability. And so this creates a natural desire to want to level up, to see what new ability you will learn on that leveling. And so, you will stop to take the time to do a bit of grinding to get those abilities. This couples with some jobs that also encourage you to look around. For example, the Blue Mage, which will lead you to want to fight as many monsters as possible to see what attacks you can learn from them. In a similar vein, the Beastmaster, to see what attack they will do when you catch them. Or the Summoner, as the best summons need to be fought to obtain them, so you will look around for these fights and then cheese them. And also, the thief job, that provides you with the ability to steal, so now you can spend your time seeing what there is to steal. Not just that though, they also get the ability to see hidden passages. Though, it is a job slightly affected by the Pixel remaster. I'm pretty happy with the remaster. I like the map that gives you a checklist of all the chests and items in that area. I like the rearrangements on the tracks. What I really don't like though is the ability to sprint from the start of the game. It would be a good quality of life improvement if the game didn't have any sprinting at all in the first place. But sprinting is one of the abilities that the thief learns. So now one entire level of this job is rendered worthless. And if you're not using modifiers, AP isn't that easy to come by. Final Fantasy V doesn't do anything exceptionally new. It makes use of established Final Fantasy story beats in the Crystals and the Warriors of Light. It uses established general story beats in an evil warlock sealed away and returning for revenge. It uses established story tropes, as has been listed. The core gameplay is a continuation of the system introduced in the previous installment, and the job system is something done before, but admittedly with a good deal of adjustment and innovation. And yet, it is not only one of the best experiences I've had with a game of its franchise, but in the RPG genre in general, especially recently. And that's achieved by what I said thus far. A well pieced together and paced narrative with extremely enjoyable and compelling characters, supported by a good base combat system with a fun and refined job system that provides its own enjoyment and assists with the management of the narrative. And I just feel like that's something to take note of. I feel like we are at the height of an anti-narrative in gaming wave. More and more I'm seeing a straight up antipathy towards narrative-based games. I remember when Astrobot came out. One of the common things said was just how great it was to see a game just being a video game. And something similar was said about Black Myth Wukong. Now, I think that there is a fair few reasons for this that I'm thinking about talking about in another video, but I quickly just want to mention one of them here. And basically, it's that scenario writers have become up their own arse. This is something that Square Enix particularly have become increasingly guilty of, even as someone who's come around on the whole fabulous stuff. A lot of plots want to seem as convoluted and smart as possible, consistently trying to be subversive and meta. And it's not like I'm completely opposed to convoluted and twisted narratives, tediously bringing up Metal Gear Solid again, but I do think it's worth noting that it's MGS3 which gets some of the most talk for its narrative aspect, and that's the most stripped down and free of meshing with other games in the franchise. Anyway, I'm not opposed to these kind of plots, but they do feel too ubiquitous now. Everyone wants to have the cerebral plot that toys with your expectations, and increasingly, a lot of them aren't very well done. Which actually brings up the question, is Final Fantasy V generic now? While these tropes and cues I've spoken about may have become rote at one point, you could actually argue it's falling back into being something fresh. Because you know what a simple groundwork also allows for? Innovation. Despite my talk of 5 being generic, it actually does some new things that are probably more associated with other games in the series. It does the changing up of the world map halfway through the game before 6 did. It is the first one to have a submarine. And it even adjusts its final cutscene depending on how many characters are knocked out in the final boss fight. Not to mention all the side content that requires careful thought to find and tackle. For example, the two towers, which require you to split your party and then alternate between the two as you move up it, with one of them only allowing magic and the other only physical attacks. At the end of the day, don't worry too much about your story being smart. Worry more about it being good.